By the winter of 1944, the war that had once promised the Reich 1,000 years of glory had turned into a storm of ruin. Across Europe, German cities lay in ashes, railways were shattered, and entire divisions vanished into the frozen mud. The Western Front was collapsing under the relentless advance of American, British, and Canadian forces. Every mile gained by the Allies exposed another shattered village, another column of broken soldiers, another hospital stripped bare by retreat. For German medical personnel, especially the nurses, the collapse was not just military, it was moral. They had served in field hospitals where the air stank of blood and smoke, where the wounded screamed until their voices gave out, and where resources had dwindled to almost nothing. As Allied units swept deeper into Germany, many of these women were captured or surrendered voluntarily, hoping that even in defeat, mercy might still exist somewhere beyond the barbed wire. The Americans, meanwhile, faced a problem of immense scale. By 1945, they were responsible for more than 2 million German prisoners of war across Europe. Every day, more columns of weary men trudged into holding areas, hands raised, faces hollow. The U.S. Army knew that managing such numbers was not only a logistical challenge, but also a moral test. The eyes of the world and of history were watching. Orders came from the highest levels of command. The United States would treat prisoners humanely, according to the Geneva Convention of 1929. It was not only a legal duty, but a statement of principle. The enemy would see what democracy looked like, not in words, but in conduct. The first thing that struck many German captives was the cleanliness. American camps, though hastily built, followed a strict code of hygiene. Latrines were organized, water was boiled, and food preparation was supervised by medical officers. Even in muddy, makeshift compounds, discipline was enforced not through cruelty, but through order. Prisoners were expected to keep their quarters clean, to wash, to shave, to maintain routines. It was a system built on respect, both for the captors and for the captured. For the Americans, cleanliness was not simply about sanitation. It was about morale, structure, and control. A clean camp was a stable camp. Disease, chaos, and despair were enemies as real as the Wehrmacht itself. When German nurses were brought into this system, some to assist in POW hospitals, others as detainees assigned medical duties, the shock was immediate. These women had served in conditions where disinfectant was a luxury, where infection spread faster than bandages could be replaced. In the field hospitals of the collapsing Reich, cleanliness had been replaced by desperation. But in American custody, the atmosphere was entirely different. White sheets were changed regularly. Instruments were sterilized. Wards smelled of alcohol and soap, not decay. Patients, many of them German soldiers, were fed, cleaned, and spoken to with dignity. It defied everything they had been told about the Allies. Behind this order stood the U.S. Army Medical Corps, a force of thousands of doctors, nurses, and technicians trained not only to heal the wounded, but to uphold the image of civilized warfare. Their hospitals were models of precision. Even as artillery thundered miles away, they documented cases, tracked supplies, and enforced procedures. American doctors treated German patients with the same professionalism they showed their own men. For many of the captured nurses, it was the first time they witnessed such consistency between words and actions. In their homeland, propaganda had painted the Americans as brutal conquerors, soulless industrial soldiers who would destroy everything German. Yet within the fences of those POW camps, the opposite appeared true. There were rules, inspections, even chapel services. Meals were regular, water was drinkable, and disease rates were lower than in many frontline German hospitals. To the nurses, it was as if they had stepped through a mirror. They had lived inside a war machine that prized obedience over compassion, discipline over decency. Now, standing in an American camp, they encountered a version of warfare that valued humanity as much as victory. This contrast between the decay they had left and the order they now witnessed sparked a quiet realization. Defeat had taken away their homeland, but it was teaching them something their own leaders never had: that true strength could exist without cruelty. The war had reached its final months, and while cities burned in the distance inside these American compounds, a different kind of battle was being fought, a battle for the moral high ground, waged not with guns but with soap, structure, and restraint. The nurses began to talk among themselves in whispers. sharing disbelief and uneasy admiration. Some wondered aloud whether this was genuine or simply a performance for the Red Cross. Others stayed silent, ashamed by the memory of how their own prisoners, Russians, Poles, Frenchmen, had been treated under the swastika. Yet none could deny what they saw with their own eyes. An enemy who in victory still chose order over revenge. It was a revelation as profound as the war itself, and for many, it marked the first moment they began to question everything they had once believed. And as more German medical staff were processed and reassigned into these facilities, the pattern repeated itself: shock, doubt, then reluctant respect. The Americans, in their discipline and decency, were rewriting the rules of captivity. It was not the treatment of prisoners that shocked the German nurses most. It was the reminder that cleanliness and humanity, even in war, were not signs of weakness but of civilization. In the months that followed Germany's collapse, the difference between the treatment of prisoners in Allied hands and those held by the Axis became impossible to ignore. Across the battle-scarred continent, German captives whispered stories that sounded almost unbelievable to their comrades still hiding in the ruins. They spoke of American camps where every man was registered, fed, and medically examined, where water flowed from taps, and where infection was not a death sentence. For many who had served under the iron discipline of the Reich, such order combined with compassion felt like a paradox. Yet it was precisely this balance, efficiency without cruelty, that defined the American system of wartime detention. In Berlin and the territories that had once formed Hitler's empire, the contrast was stark. German camps for Allied prisoners had often been bleak, overcrowded, and starved of resources long before the war's end. Even when not deliberately brutal, they reflected a system collapsing under its own ideology. The Nazi leadership had viewed prisoners as instruments of propaganda or expendable labor, not as men protected by international law. Soviet camps were worse still, driven by vengeance and deprivation. In that world, survival was a privilege, not a right. Against such a backdrop, the American approach stood out like an anomaly, clean, structured, almost clinical. To many Germans, it was as though the victors had built a new moral order out of discipline and disinfectant. The foundation of that order lay in a philosophy that had taken root long before the war's end. American commanders understood that a soldier's conduct toward the defeated reflected the values of the nation itself. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, insisted on adherence to the Geneva Convention not merely as a legal obligation, but as a moral strategy. "We will not stoop to their methods," he wrote in one directive. Humane treatment, he believed, was a weapon, a means to show that democracy could conquer tyranny without becoming it. To Eisenhower and his staff, the image of American camps was as important as any battlefield victory. Cleanliness was propaganda of the highest kind, a silent argument that civilization, not barbarism, would outlast the war. For German nurses who were reassigned under Allied supervision, this was a revelation that shook years of indoctrination. Many had been trained under the National Socialist model of medical duty, where the individual was secondary to the state, and where compassion was often sacrificed to ideology. They had worked in hospitals where resources were diverted to wounded officers or SS units, while ordinary soldiers were left to die. They had been taught to see enemies as subhuman, their suffering as justified by politics. But in American-run facilities, the lines blurred. Here, German soldiers and Allied staff shared wards. Here, an American surgeon would operate on a wounded Wehrmacht soldier without hesitation, guided by a principle that transcended nationality. Reports from Red Cross inspectors confirmed what the nurses witnessed firsthand. American camps were consistently rated among the best in hygiene, nutrition, and medical care. POW hospitals were often cleaner than civilian facilities in war-torn Germany. In France, Belgium, and even within occupied Germany itself, U.S. medical teams built functioning treatment centers in the midst of devastation. Each was supplied with soap, disinfectant, and linen, items scarce in much of Europe by 1945. The Americans enforced cleanliness as a matter of pride. Every camp had a sanitation officer, and daily inspections ensured compliance. Failure to maintain standards could lead to demotion, even court-martial. It was a system that merged military order with moral purpose. For the German nurses assigned to these camps, Every day became a quiet confrontation with conscience. They saw men they once called enemies cleaning wounds, distributing medicine, or checking on prisoners with genuine care. They saw that the Americans did not curse the German patients, did not gloat over their defeat. There was discipline but not cruelty, distance but not hatred. Some of the nurses struggled to understand how this was possible. They had been told the Allies were driven by revenge. Instead, they found doctors who quoted the Geneva Convention as though it were scripture, officers who believed that how a nation treated its prisoners revealed its true character. This realization was not without conflict. Pride and shame battled within the minds of these women. They could not ignore the memories of Allied air raids, the dead civilians, the devastation of their homeland. Yet, within the barbed wire, they witnessed a different kind of victory, one built not on destruction but on discipline. The Americans were winning not only with their weapons but with their values. The spotless wards, the organized kitchens, the methodical routines all spoke of a deeper order, one rooted in faith that decency could survive even in war. By the time the German surrender became official in May 1945, thousands of captured medical workers had seen enough to know that the future would be shaped not by ideology, but by ethics. Some would later testify to the Red Cross, describing their astonishment at the standards they had observed. Others would carry those lessons quietly into the rebuilding of post-war Germany, influencing hospitals and nursing schools that sought to separate medicine from politics once and for all. For the Americans, this was no act of mercy alone, it was strategy. Clean camps and humane treatment helped maintain discipline, prevented uprisings, and earned invaluable goodwill. For the Germans who experienced it, it was an education in what true civilization looked like when the guns finally fell silent. And for the nurses who had walked through those gates expecting punishment, the memory of that order and cleanliness remained the most haunting thing of all. They had entered captivity believing they were stepping into darkness. Instead, they found a mirror, one that reflected everything their own regime had failed to be. The story of those nurses does not end at the gates of the American camps. What followed in the weeks after their arrival were moments that revealed more about the nature of humanity in war than any battle or speech could. Through the eyes of these women, a dozen angles began to form, each one offering a different view of the same unsettling truth. The first was human, and it began with silence. In the camp wards, the nurses moved through neat rows of beds, hearing only the hum of fans and the soft rustle of sheets. The men lying there were their own countrymen, soldiers who had once fought under the same flag. Yet they were being tended by Americans with a gentleness that felt almost unreal. There were no shouts, no blows, no humiliation. The discipline was quiet and efficient, and for the German nurses who had lived under constant fear of superiors and political officers, that quietness felt like mercy. They watched as American orderlies adjusted a bandage with precision, as a doctor calmly explained a treatment plan, as clean water was poured without waste. In those small gestures, the nurses saw something that had been lost to them long before their capture, a kind of humanity stripped of ideology. The second angle was medical. American wartime medicine had evolved into a machine of efficiency, supported by technology and an unwavering belief in procedure. Every step was documented, every instrument sterilized, every wound photographed for record. The nurses, many trained under wartime shortages, were stunned to see abundance even in captivity. Gauze, antibiotics, clean gloves, proper lighting, these were luxuries to them. They had treated men with nothing but torn cloth and cold water. Here, even prisoners received the same sterile care as Allied soldiers. American doctors adhered to medical ethics with near-religious precision. A patient was a patient, no insignia, no politics. The Germans could not understand it at first. How could one heal an enemy so thoroughly while fighting him so fiercely? Yet the Americans did. Their belief in the sanctity of medicine was absolute. To the nurses, it was as if the Americans had weaponized compassion, turning cleanliness and care into acts of dominance. The message was clear. Even in war, civilization must not decay. The third angle was psychological. Inside the camps, the Americans understood that order and hygiene were not only physical necessities, but psychological tools. Clean surroundings meant structure. Structure meant calm. A calm prisoner was a manageable prisoner. There was logic beneath the morality. Every freshly scrubbed floor, every scheduled meal, Every morning roll call was part of a larger system designed to break chaos and restore identity. The nurses noticed how the German prisoners, once hollow-eyed and hostile, slowly began to adapt. They shaved. They straightened their posture. Some even volunteered to help in the kitchens or infirmaries. The Americans, knowingly or not, were rebuilding the spirit of the defeated through routine and decency. It was a subtle form of control, one that did not rely on violence. The Germans obeyed not because they were forced to, but because they saw a reason in the rules. And in that transformation, the nurses witnessed a profound psychological truth. Dignity could be restored even to those who had lost everything. Another angle emerged through leadership. The order that pervaded the camps was no accident. It flowed from a chain of command that took moral responsibility seriously. Eisenhower's directives were explicit. There would be no unnecessary cruelty, no degradation. Commanders were told that the way they treated prisoners would echo far beyond the war itself. American officers, trained in both discipline and restraint, enforced these policies with precision. Inspections were constant. Medical facilities were prioritized, not as charity, but as symbols of order. For the German nurses who had lived under a leadership that ruled through fear, this was disorienting. They saw American officers walking among their men without bodyguards, speaking plainly, expecting obedience without threats. Authority in the American sense was not derived from terror but from trust. It was a kind of leadership that made cruelty seem primitive by comparison. The fifth angle was moral. For many of the German nurses, witnessing humane treatment of prisoners forced an inner reckoning. They had served a regime that had glorified suffering and condemned compassion as weakness. Now in defeat, they found themselves protected by the very ideals they had been told to despise. Some could not accept it. Others quietly began to question everything they had believed. When they saw an American medic kneel beside a feverish German patient and wipe his forehead, the act seemed both simple and revolutionary. In that moment, the myth of racial and moral superiority, the cornerstone of Nazi ideology, crumbled in silence. The nurses understood that the Americans were not proving their strength through domination, but through restraint. Cleanliness, order, and fairness became instruments of moral conquest. There was also the enemy's angle, the perspective of the German prisoners themselves. To them, the nurses' disbelief was familiar. Many had expected starvation or violence. Instead, they found rules that made sense, meals that arrived on time, and guards who enforced order without malice. Some even began to feel shame. They remembered the Allied prisoners who had suffered in German custody, beaten, starved, stripped of dignity. Now the roles were reversed, and the contrast was unbearable. The nurses shared that shame. Each spotless ward, each well-fed prisoner, was a reminder of how far their own nation had fallen from humanity. Day after day, these overlapping angles formed a single, undeniable picture. Cleanliness was not a matter of hygiene alone, it was a statement of identity. The Americans had turned order into ideology, discipline into diplomacy. In every scrubbed floor and every white sheet lay a quiet assertion. Civilization belongs to those who protect it, not those who destroy it. And for the nurses, that truth was harder to face than any battlefield defeat. As the weeks turned into months, more layers of understanding began to unfold for those who lived and worked inside the American camps. What had first seemed like simple cleanliness revealed itself as part of a broader, deliberate philosophy of warfare. The Americans believed that victory was not just won through weapons, but through values. Their enemy's ideology had celebrated cruelty as strength. The Americans were determined to prove that discipline, mercy, and respect were the true marks of power. For the German nurses, this realization came slowly, almost painfully, as they began to study not just the routines of the camps, but the minds behind them. They saw a system where leadership was built on example, not intimidation. The commanding officers were not distant figures issuing threats from behind desks. They walked through the camps daily, inspecting kitchens, speaking to prisoners, even sharing meals with enlisted men. When they enforced rules, they did so with calm precision, not rage. It was a kind of control that did not humiliate but demanded respect through fairness. To German eyes, trained under years of authoritarian command, it felt both alien and unsettling. One of the clearest examples came from the camp medical centers themselves. In the German system, hospitals had been governed by rank and ideology. Political officers could overrule medical staff. Resources were distributed by favoritism, and compassion was secondary to status. In American-run facilities, everything was inverted. Doctors held authority based on expertise, not politics. Nurses could question an order if it endangered a patient. Sanitation officers could reprimand guards if hygiene was neglected. The entire structure revolved around function, not fear. It was efficient, but more than that, it was just. German nurses who once hesitated to speak in front of superiors now found themselves listened to, even by American officers. Their skills were recognized, their suggestions implemented. For women who had lived under a regime that treated them as tools of the state, this respect was transformative. It showed them that professionalism could exist without tyranny. The Americans also understood the psychological war being fought beyond the fences. Reports from captured territories had shown how deeply Nazi propaganda had poisoned German minds, filling them with visions of Allied cruelty. To dismantle that narrative, every clean kitchen, every organized barrack, every courteous word was part of a grander message. The Reich had lied. The enemy was not barbaric. He was disciplined, rational, and humane. Eisenhower's intelligence officers knew that these impressions would spread. Released prisoners would carry stories home, stories that undermined the myth of Nazi virtue more effectively than any leaflet. For the Americans, cleanliness became a form of information warfare. A spotless camp was more than a reflection of order. It was a statement of moral superiority. The effect on the German nurses was subtle but profound. Many found themselves caught between admiration and guilt. They were proud of their efficiency, their training, their resilience under hardship. Yet now they saw that these same traits could serve something purer. Organization without cruelty. Obedience without blind ideology. At night in the barracks, they would whisper about what they had seen. Some wept, confessing that the Americans had shown more compassion to German prisoners than the Reich had ever shown to its own dissenters. Others defended their homeland, insisting that defeat did not erase loyalty. But all of them knew that something inside had changed. They had witnessed a form of victory that went beyond the battlefield. The moral transformation was mirrored in the smallest details. The Americans insisted that even waste be handled with order. Refuse was buried or burned according to strict procedure. Kitchens were inspected daily. Water was tested for contamination. Lice checks were mandatory. At first, the nurses assumed this was simple obsession, a soldier's compulsion for control. But soon they realized it was something deeper. Cleanliness was not only about hygiene. It was about respect for life itself. Every washed floor, every disinfected tool declared that chaos would not rule. That even in the shadow of death, order could prevail. In that sense, the Americans fought entropy itself, refusing to let war degrade them into the savagery that had consumed so many others. Even the enemy's perception was shaped by this unseen discipline. When Red Cross inspectors visited, they recorded near-identical findings across multiple American facilities: consistent rations, functioning hospitals, access to mail, organized recreation, and medical treatment available to all. German officers taken prisoner were stunned to be addressed by rank, offered the chance to write home, and even allowed to supervise camp labor. Such gestures were strategic, of course. They helped maintain control and ensured cooperation. But they also demonstrated a kind of confident morality. The Americans did not fear losing power through fairness. They understood that moral clarity reinforced authority rather than weakening it. Among the German nurses, there emerged a quiet sense of envy, even longing. They had served a state that demanded loyalty but gave little humanity in return. Here in enemy hands, they found a system that rewarded competence and valued life. One nurse later recalled how she felt ashamed to realize the enemy had kept his soul while we had lost ours. That sentiment echoed among many who lived through those final months of captivity. The Americans had not only defeated their army, they had conquered their assumptions about what civilization meant. As spring turned into summer, the war officially ended, but the moral struggle continued inside those camps. The nurses knew they would one day be released, sent back to a homeland in ruins, but the lessons they had learned could not be unlearned. They had seen with their own eyes that compassion could coexist with strength, that order did not require oppression, and that even the victors of the bloodiest war in history could still believe in decency. The Americans had turned their camps into symbols, not of dominance but of discipline guided by conscience. And through those symbols, They had taught their former enemies a truth no weapon could enforce. By the time the gates opened and the nurses were escorted out to begin the long journey home, they carried with them a memory more enduring than the war itself. It was the sight of polished floors under harsh light, the smell of soap and steel, the sound of an American medic's calm voice echoing through the corridors of a place that should have been a prison, but instead felt like a lesson in humanity. It was, in every sense, the quiet turning point of the moral war that outlasted the military one. By the end of 1945, as the war's smoke began to clear, the world's attention turned from the battlefields to the ruins left behind. And within those ruins, to the hearts and minds of the defeated, the German nurses who had served in the American camps were now being repatriated. Many of them boarded military trucks in silence, escorted by guards who no longer carried hatred in their eyes, only fatigue. The drive across shattered roads and through villages reduced to rubble was surreal. Once proud cities had been flattened, the Reich's banners torn and burned. Yet the discipline they had witnessed in captivity followed them, echoing in their memories like a haunting lesson. They had seen order built on conscience, not fear, and now they were returning to a homeland that had been built on lies. One of those nurses, identified in records as Anna Weiss, would later become a symbol of that moral crossroads. Before her capture, she had been stationed in a field hospital near Aachen, working 16-hour shifts under constant bombardment. She had believed utterly in duty to the Reich, not out of fanaticism but because she had been taught there was no other choice. Her surrender had felt like betrayal. Yet in the American camp, she had witnessed something she could not reconcile with her beliefs. American doctors treating German soldiers with the same care they gave their own wounded. One night, she watched as a young American medic removed a bullet from a captured SS officer, a man who, only weeks earlier, might have executed prisoners himself. When she asked why he bothered, the medic's reply was simple: because he's human, and that's enough. Those words carved into her mind more deeply than any propaganda ever could. When Anna returned to her hometown, she found the streets filled with silence. Her mother was gone, her hospital reduced to rubble, her country a ghost of what it had been. But what haunted her most was not the destruction, it was the contrast. She could not forget the calm efficiency, the dignity of discipline she had witnessed among her former enemies. That memory became her private rebellion. In the years that followed, she volunteered for the reconstruction efforts led by Allied medical teams. She trained under American instructors who taught her new sterilization methods, surgical techniques, and field triage protocols. She embraced their philosophy, order rooted in empathy. And in doing so, she became one of the first German nurses to help rebuild a healthcare system purged of ideology. Her story was not unique. Across post-war Europe, captured medical personnel returned home carrying fragments of the same revelation. They had seen that civilization did not end where mercy began. It began there. They had seen that the true strength of an army lay not in its cruelty but in its restraint. These were quiet lessons, unspoken in public, but they spread like roots through the ruins. They shaped a generation of medical professionals who rebuilt hospitals not as instruments of the state, but as sanctuaries for the human spirit. In that sense, the moral victory the Americans had achieved inside their POW camps continued long after the guns fell silent. But the story's climax was not only about transformation, it was about revelation. In the early months of 1946, Allied investigators opened classified archives containing thousands of photographs and reports from the POW camps. Their goal was to document war crimes, but what they found among the evidence was something unexpected. Meticulous records of sanitation inspections, medical treatments, and even recreation schedules for prisoners. In one report, an officer noted that the maintenance of order and hygiene within camps is not only a matter of health, but of ideology, to demonstrate that the democratic spirit functions even in captivity. It was an astonishing statement, written not for propaganda, but as policy. Cleanliness had become a moral weapon. That realization reached beyond the camps. When these documents were presented at the Nuremberg trials, some defense attorneys attempted to use them as a counter-argument, claiming that if the Allies had treated prisoners so well, the Reich's abuses were no worse than the hardships of war. The judges swiftly rejected the argument. But the irony remained powerful. The Americans' discipline, their insistence on moral order, was now being used as proof that there had been another way. that cruelty had never been necessary. The comparison condemned the Nazi regime more effectively than any accusation. It showed that even under strain, even when dealing with enemies, the Americans had chosen principle over vengeance. This moral clarity echoed into global consciousness. Philosophers, journalists, and theologians began to write about what they called the cleanliness of conscience. They argued that after the dirt and destruction of total war, the real struggle was to preserve moral hygiene, to prevent corruption of the spirit. The American camps, in their strict order and restraint, became symbols of that idea. They represented the belief that civilization could survive its darkest hour through self-discipline and moral consistency. For many, that was more inspiring than any military triumph. Anna Weiss would later be invited to speak at a post-war medical conference in Bonn, where she addressed young nurses from both Germany and the Allied nations. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but her message was clear. We were taught to heal bodies and obey orders, but in that camp I learned we must also heal souls, even our enemies. That is how the world begins again. Her words drew silence, then applause. It was not political rhetoric. It was lived truth, born from the paradox of defeat. Outside, Europe was rebuilding, brick by brick, bridge by bridge. But beneath that reconstruction lay an invisible architecture of lessons. The discipline of the Americans, the respect for order without oppression, the insistence on hygiene as an act of dignity. These ideas seeped into the fabric of post-war institutions. Hospitals adopted standardized cleanliness codes modeled after Allied medical camps. Nursing schools emphasized ethics over obedience. Even in distant lands where war had left scars of its own, the American example became a quiet template for what it meant to win without losing humanity. By 1947, the story of the German nurses had faded from newspapers, buried under the weight of new headlines, the Marshall Plan, the Iron Curtain, the dawn of the Cold War. But for those who had lived it, the memory endured. It lingered in every sterile corridor, every orderly hospital ward, every hand that washed before tending a wound. The war had ended, but its moral echo had just begun. In the quiet months that followed Germany's surrender, a different kind of battle began. One fought not with bullets or bombs, but with memory, narrative, and moral authority. The war for history itself had started, and buried beneath the rubble of surrender were documents, testimonies, and silent witnesses that revealed a truth few in Europe were prepared to accept, that the victors had not only triumphed militarily, but morally. Deep inside the Allied archives, a classified program known as Operation Dustpan was initiated. Its purpose was not destruction, but preservation, to collect evidence of both atrocity and integrity. Among the thousands of reports cataloged were those from the American prisoner of war camps, where conditions were recorded with precision bordering on obsession. Inspections, medical charts, disciplinary logs, food distribution lists, every detail had been written, signed, and sealed. To the military, it was proof of adherence to the Geneva Convention. To historians who later uncovered it, it was evidence of something more profound, the deliberate projection of civilization amidst chaos. Behind this effort stood a little-known branch of the U.S. Army, the Psychological Warfare Division. Their mission was clear, to shape the moral narrative of the post-war world. The Americans understood that the next great conflict would not be fought with tanks but with ideas. In internal memos circulated between London and Washington, officials argued that moral perception was as strategic as territorial control. If the world saw America as a nation capable of compassion even toward its enemies, then democracy itself would stand as the superior system, not merely because it won wars, but because it refused to lose its soul in them. Clean camps, fair treatment, humane order, these were not just acts of decency. They were weapons of ideology. The operation was quiet, methodical, and precise. Teams of military photographers were dispatched to document the camps, not just the barracks and infirmaries, but the interactions between guards and prisoners. These images would later appear in Allied propaganda leaflets distributed across a ruined Germany, carrying messages like, "Even in defeat, your sons are treated with dignity." It was a calculated gesture, designed to break the cycle of hatred and to plant the seed of cooperation. What few knew at the time was that these same photographs were also being analyzed by intelligence officers To measure the psychological response of the German population, letters intercepted from families revealed surprise, disbelief, even shame. Some asked why the Americans had shown more humanity than their own leaders ever had. That reaction, that quiet, reflective shame, was precisely what the Psychological Warfare Division hoped to achieve. But not all within the Allied ranks supported the policy. In several instances, field commanders argued that such leniency risked emboldening the defeated or giving sanctuary to war criminals. In a tense correspondence between General Dwight D. Eisenhower and General Omar Bradley, the debate surfaced in writing. Eisenhower, pragmatic yet deeply aware of history's gaze, insisted that discipline and decency are not opposites. They are the same instrument if one knows how to play it. Bradley agreed reluctantly, but he feared the burden placed on soldiers asked to treat their former enemies with care. Yet the policy held, and its results would echo far beyond the war's end. One of the most revealing documents from the era came from a U.S. Army sanitary engineer named Captain Robert Elkins. Stationed near Frankfurt, Elkins oversaw the health conditions of thousands of German POWs. In his final report to headquarters, he wrote, "The preservation of cleanliness in the camps is more than a logistical requirement. It is a symbol of moral hygiene. We must show them what civilization looks like, even in defeat." Those words were underlined twice by his superior officer before being archived. Decades later, historians would cite Elkins's statement as the essence of America's post-war moral strategy: to win not only the body of Europe, but its conscience. At the same time, American intelligence officers were already preparing for the next ideological conflict, the one against Soviet expansion. Within the same moral framework that guided POW treatment, they began crafting propaganda designed to contrast Western order and cleanliness with Eastern austerity and suspicion. Reports from occupied Germany noted that Soviet camps were often overcrowded, unsanitary, and cruel, a mirror image of the American model. The contrast was intentional. Cleanliness, once a matter of health, had become a statement of ideology. It signified discipline, transparency, and respect for the human condition, traits that democracy claimed as its own. Meanwhile, back in Germany, the nurses who had once been shocked by the Americans' orderliness were being quietly interviewed by Allied debriefing units. Their testimonies were collected not for public record, but for psychological study. These women, who had once worked under the swastika, were now unwitting symbols of transformation. In their words, American officers saw evidence that morality could be contagious, that exposure to humanity could erode indoctrination. One nurse, her name redacted in the files, described how the first time she saw American doctors sharing medical supplies with German POWs, she wept in secret. "I realized," she wrote, "that we had been the ones in captivity, not them." Such statements would later appear in educational broadcasts across occupied Germany, part of a campaign called Neuanfang, New Beginning. The campaign's success was measured not in propaganda victories but in cultural shifts. Within a few years, surveys conducted in the Western occupation zones showed a remarkable change in public perception. When asked to describe their impressions of the American forces, the majority of Germans used words like disciplined, organized, and clean. It was no accident. It was policy. The Americans had rewritten their enemy's perception of civilization itself, not through domination, but through demonstration. And while the Soviet bloc would use fear and control to cement loyalty, the West built its foundation on respect and order. By the late 1940s, the once secret reports from Operation Dustpan were declassified internally and shared with diplomatic staff involved in the Marshall Plan. They formed the ideological backbone of post-war reconstruction policy. The belief that the restoration of Europe would not come from punishment but from example. The American camps, with their scrubbed floors and disciplined guards, became metaphors for an entire civilization's renewal. They stood as proof that the strongest nations were not those who conquered their enemies, but those who kept their humanity intact while doing so. That moral architecture would later influence every level of the Western alliance, from the design of hospitals and schools to the tone of international diplomacy. Cleanliness had become a language of order, a quiet promise that civilization could endure even after the collapse of empires. The German nurses who had once trembled at the thought of American captivity had unknowingly become witnesses to one of history's most profound paradoxes, that the measure of victory lies not in power, but in restraint. And as Europe entered the uncertain dawn of the Cold War, those lessons would become more vital than ever, for in the shadows of a new ideological divide, the memory of those clean, disciplined camps remained, silent, steady, and unmistakably human. In the years immediately following the war, the aftershocks of what those nurses had seen continued to ripple through Europe. The battlefields had gone silent, but a quieter war for decency, order, and human dignity had begun. The devastation of Nazi ideology had left not just cities in ruins, but consciences fractured. Millions of people had lived under systems that equated obedience with virtue, cruelty with strength. Yet in the midst of defeat, a different example had been planted, one that came not from speeches but from the simple discipline of the American camps. What began as an act of military necessity, to control, to organize, to prevent disease, had evolved into a profound statement of civilization. And in the aftermath of the war, that statement began shaping everything from the structure of post-war institutions to the psychology of recovery itself. By 1946, the Allied Control Council had begun implementing new medical and hygiene standards across occupied Germany. These standards were heavily influenced by the American POW camp model. Records show that U.S. Army medical officers like Colonel Howard B. Sprague and Captain Robert Elkins were appointed as advisors to Germany's newly forming public health offices. They introduced strict regulations on hospital sanitation, water purification, and medical ethics. Where Nazi medicine had served ideology, Allied medicine now served humanity. German nurses and doctors, many of whom had worked under rigid propaganda systems, were retrained under American and British supervision. The focus was not only on technical skill but on moral responsibility, the idea that every patient, regardless of race, uniform, or belief, was entitled to care. It was a radical concept for a nation emerging from years of indoctrination, but one that took root quickly. These lessons extended far beyond medicine. The American approach to order and discipline influenced post-war reconstruction at every level. In towns where POW camps had once stood, local citizens petitioned to keep the camp hospitals and kitchens operating as community facilities. Many were converted into schools or public clinics, symbols of renewal built from the remnants of captivity. In Heidelberg, the site of one of the largest U.S.-run hospitals became the foundation for the University Medical Center's Post-War Research Institute. Its guiding principle, clean hands, clear conscience, was inspired directly by the discipline of American medics. The phrase became part of the curriculum for German nursing students throughout the 1950s. It represented not just physical cleanliness, but moral integrity. Meanwhile, in the United States, reports from returning officers began circulating among military strategists and policymakers. These accounts described how humane treatment of prisoners had yielded not rebellion, but cooperation. Intelligence gathered from well-treated German POWs had proven far more reliable than that extracted through coercion. The Army noted this in internal reviews, leading to reforms that would later define U.S. military doctrine during the Korean and Vietnam Wars. The belief that respect could be a strategic weapon was no longer theoretical. It had been proven on the battlefields and in the barracks. Of World War II, American generals like Eisenhower and Bradley recognized that victory was more than the absence of enemies, and it was the preservation of the principles for which they had fought. Back in Germany, the moral echoes of those lessons found their way into the rebuilding of society. German citizens who had seen the inside of American camps often became quiet ambassadors for democratic values. They told stories, not of cruelty or vengeance, but of structure, fairness, and dignity. For many civilians, especially women and nurses, these accounts contrasted sharply with the brutality they had witnessed under their own regime. One post-war sociological study conducted by the Frankfurt School in 1948 revealed that former POWs and nurses exposed to Allied discipline were more likely to support democratic institutions and reject authoritarian ideals. The study concluded that moral exposure can function as re-education more effectively than coercion. It was a striking validation of the American belief that order rooted in decency could rebuild a conscience faster than any ideology imposed by force. The ripple extended even into culture. Post-war German literature, art, and cinema began reflecting a fascination with cleanliness, not merely physical, but ethical. In films such as Die Brücke, 1959, and Der Arzt von Stalingrad, 1958, the portrayal of hygiene and medical integrity symbolized moral redemption. The image of the disciplined American medic, once the enemy, became a silent emblem of what civilization could look like when stripped of hatred. Museums and historical societies began preserving artifacts from POW camps, surgical kits, medical logs, even soap wrappers, as reminders that decency had survived amid the ruins. For the German nurses, these objects carried personal meaning. They represented a time when their hands, once instruments of propaganda, had been taught to serve something higher. Internationally, the effects were just as significant. The United Nations, established in 1945, drew heavily from the Geneva Principles reaffirmed by Allied behavior during the war. The treatment of German POWs became a benchmark for new humanitarian conventions. The International Committee of the Red Cross cited American practices as the standard for camp hygiene and prisoner welfare. By 1949, the Third Geneva Convention formally codified many of these wartime precedents. Clear proof that the legacy of those clean, disciplined camps had reshaped global ethics. Even the Soviet Union, often in ideological opposition, quietly improved conditions in its own camps after Western criticism drew stark contrasts. The war for morality had produced measurable change. Yet beneath the policies and progress lay the human memory, fragile, haunting, and enduring. For many German nurses, the war had left invisible wounds. They had lived through contradictions. The ideology of obedience, the shock of defeat, the revelation of mercy. Some could not reconcile these opposing truths and withdrew from public life. Unable to bear the weight of their transformation, others found purpose in rebuilding. Anna Weiss, whose story had once symbolized that revelation, continued her work with international relief efforts. She helped establish new nursing programs under UNESCO and lectured about medical ethics in conflict zones. Her message was simple but powerful. The body must be kept clean, yes, but the soul must never be allowed to rot. Her voice, though quiet, carried the resonance of a generation that had seen both the depths of human cruelty and the power of human decency. In this aftermath, one lesson became undeniable: that civilization could be measured by how it treated those who could no longer fight back. The Americans had understood this instinctively, turning discipline into compassion and compassion into strategy. The German nurses had learned it painfully, their world turned upside down by the sight of enemy order. And Europe, emerging from ashes, began to rebuild itself not just with brick and steel, but with the invisible mortar of moral reconstruction. The war had ended, but the idea it revealed, and that humanity, when disciplined, could outlast even destruction, was just beginning to take root. As Europe emerged from the ashes, the quiet revolution that had begun inside the walls of those American prisoner of war camps continued to spread, unseen but unstoppable. By the early 1950s, the continent was divided between two new empires, one built on the promise of liberty, the other on the grip of control. Yet for millions who had witnessed the discipline and humanity of the Americans firsthand, there was no question which system carried the moral strength to endure. The memory of the camps, clean, organized, and bound by principle, became a living metaphor for the West's claim to moral superiority. Across the Atlantic, American policymakers understood the significance of that perception. Reports from the U.S. Office of Military Government in Germany described how former enemies had become unlikely advocates for democratic ideals simply because of the way they had been treated in captivity. It was proof that morality could outlast violence, that compassion could achieve what propaganda never could. In the heart of West Germany, this quiet transformation took visible form. In 1951, the newly founded Federal Republic launched its National Public Health Initiative, adopting American-style standards of hygiene and hospital administration. The blueprint for many of these reforms came directly from Allied post-war manuals, the same documents used to train staff in POW facilities. Every sink, sterilizer, and inspection schedule carried with it an echo of the discipline that had once stunned the German nurses. When questioned about the symbolic nature of these practices, Chancellor Konrad Adenauer remarked in a 1952 speech, "Cleanliness is not merely for the body. It is the mark of a free society that respects order without fear." His words captured the essence of what had been learned, that moral clarity could be maintained through simple, visible acts of discipline. American influence continued to guide this recovery through institutions like the Marshall Plan and the United States Information Service. Propaganda films circulated across Europe, showing images of orderly classrooms, spotless hospitals, and efficient city halls, scenes meant to demonstrate not luxury but civilization. Even in war-torn regions of Italy and France, where anti-American sentiment had simmered, these films were received with reluctant admiration. They reminded audiences that victory need not descend into chaos, that strength could coexist with decency. Behind every frame was a subtle reminder of what the German nurses had once seen with their own eyes, the order of the conqueror rooted not in domination, but in dignity. Yet not all lessons were easily absorbed. The scars of ideology ran deep, and for some Germans the memory of captivity remained entangled with shame. Letters preserved in post-war archives reveal a struggle to reconcile pride with gratitude. One former Red Cross nurse, writing in 1953, confessed, "We hated them because they were our enemies, but we envied them because they were clean, in their hands, in their hearts." We did not understand that kind of strength until it was too late. Her words spoke to an entire generation grappling with moral awakening. It was a painful admission that the war had not only been lost on the battlefield, but in the realm of values. The realization that the enemy had behaved more humanely than their own leaders left a wound deeper than defeat itself. Meanwhile, in the United States, the legacy of humane warfare became a matter of national identity. Military academies incorporated lessons from World War II POW management into their ethics curricula. Manuals on leadership stressed the importance of discipline through compassion, emphasizing that respect for one's enemy reflected respect for one's own nation. The clean American camps, once merely logistical achievements, had become moral templates. They showed that the capacity for control and care were not opposites. They were reflections of the same strength. In this way, what began as a pragmatic response to the chaos of war evolved into a guiding philosophy of modern military conduct. Across the ocean, the generation of German nurses who had been witnesses to this transformation aged quietly, many fading into obscurity as the world moved into the Cold War. But their legacy lived on in the institutions they helped build, and in the unspoken values they carried into their work. Hospitals rebuilt under Allied guidance became beacons of modern medicine. International exchanges between American and German medical schools deepened cooperation, bridging old wounds with shared purpose. The standards of hygiene and discipline first enforced by occupation authorities became normal practice. And from that normalcy, trust was born. The same meticulous order that had once inspired shock now inspired confidence. By the 1960s, Germany's hospitals and medical universities ranked among the most advanced in Europe. Their foundations rested not only on technology and science but on ethics, forged in the crucible of defeat. The clean camps had become the symbolic origin of a new professional identity, one where order served not tyranny, but humanity. In memoirs and nursing journals published decades later, surviving nurses reflected on their wartime experiences with an honesty that bordered on confession. They described the shock of realizing that cleanliness could be a moral act, that discipline could reflect mercy rather than authority. "We had thought the Americans were weak because they cared," wrote one. "But it was we who had been weakened by obedience. They were strong because they knew how to stay human." The ripple of that revelation reached far beyond Europe. The standards developed in American and Allied POW camps became international norms, influencing humanitarian organizations, medical training, and even the formation of NATO's emergency response units. In times of crisis, from the Korean War to Vietnam and beyond, the idea persisted that moral order and sanitary discipline were inseparable marks of a civilized army. The lessons learned from the nurses' astonishment became a silent doctrine repeated across generations. Cleanliness, order, and restraint were not merely practical, they were symbols of moral power. By the turn of the 1970s, When the last of the surviving German nurses gave interviews to historians, the memory of those camps had transformed from a wartime episode into a moral parable. Their shock, once a fleeting emotion, had become a lasting insight into the nature of civilization itself. They had entered captivity expecting punishment and found instead the power of discipline guided by conscience. In their silence, they carried a truth that transcended victory or defeat, that the true triumph of war lies not in destruction, but in the preservation of humanity amidst it. The story of those nurses, of their disbelief and awakening, had begun as a footnote in the chronicles of war. But in the decades that followed, it became something greater, a quiet testimony to the strength of decency in a world scarred by cruelty. The Americans had built their camps to manage prisoners. What they built instead was a monument to civilization, one scrubbed clean not of dirt but of hatred. And though time would fade the names and faces of those who witnessed it, the lesson remained indelible, that even in war, cleanliness and of body, of order, of conscience, can be an act of courage. In the final reckoning, when the noise of war had long faded and the maps of Europe had been redrawn, what remained were not only ruins and monuments, but lessons etched in quiet moments, in the discipline of hands that chose to heal instead of harm, in the calm order of a camp that refused to mirror its enemy's cruelty, in the stunned silence of those who discovered that their conquerors were not monsters, but men of principle. The story of the German nurses who were shocked by the cleanliness of American camps is not just a historical anecdote. It is a mirror held up to humanity itself. It reveals the simplest truth that in times of darkness, morality is measured not by victory, but by restraint, by the ability to remain decent when everything around demands brutality. The Americans who maintained those camps likely saw themselves as ordinary soldiers following protocol, enforcing order, keeping disease away, obeying the Geneva Convention. But history would see them differently. Their discipline became a moral language, a statement that civilization does not end at the edge of war, but begins there. Every clean floor, every ration served with fairness, every act of medical care given without prejudice was a defiance of the barbarism that the world had just witnessed. In their calm precision there was resistance. In their humanity there was strength. For the German nurses, that revelation shattered the foundations of everything they had been taught. They had served a regime that glorified obedience, that worshipped power and despised compassion. Yet in the hands of their enemies they found order without cruelty, authority without fear. It was a contradiction that forced them, and their nation, to re-examine what civilization truly meant. The cleanliness of the American camps became a symbol of something deeper: the hygiene of conscience, the discipline of morality, the belief that even in chaos, one can choose decency. As decades passed, the memory of that contrast faded into history books, yet its essence endures in every hospital ward, every humanitarian code, every soldier trained to see humanity in his adversary. The war taught many things: strategy, sacrifice, destruction. But through these nurses' eyes it also taught redemption. It showed that strength is not measured by domination but by self-control, that victory achieved without humanity is only another form of defeat. And so, when history whispers of that strange moment, when German nurses stood silent before the spotless order of their enemy's camp, it reminds us of something eternal, that civilization is not inherited. It is maintained. Like cleanliness itself, it must be practiced every day, especially when the world grows dark. Because in the end, the true legacy of that war was not written in battles or borders, but in the simple, steady hands that refused to let compassion die, hands that proved, in the ruins of war, that being civilized is itself an act of courage.